Yes, yes, yes. Good afternoon. The recent bankruptcy of Black Jewel was devastating to its miners. The families are still left unpaid for weeks of work. Child support was deducted from many people's accounts and does not appear to have been paid or have gotten to the children that need it. Others claim they were given cold checks, and different businesses may have suffered by accepting those checks. What we have today are miners sitting on a rail line, trying to make sure that they will be paid for the work that they've done. One of the most unfortunate aspects of this situation is it was and should have been avoidable if the Labor Cabinet had simply enforced the law. Kentucky law under KRS 337.200 requires that any mining company that has been in Kentucky operating for less than 5 years must post a performance bond. That bond would cover 4 weeks of wages for all of its employees. Black Jewel and 2 other subsidiaries related to Black Jewel have been operating for less than 5 years. A performance bond under law was required, should have been in place, and would have paid every dime owed to these miners. When it was revealed that the performance bond had not been secured, the Labor Cabinet Secretary offered an excuse that I believe was unacceptable. The Labor Cabinet Secretary said it's a self-policing law, and how would we know what companies were out there operating in Kentucky that had been in operation for less than 5 years? Given that excuse and my concern that there could be other companies out there right now with miners unprotected, that if a Black Jewel situation happened at another company, we could have miners in the same difficult position that we've seen, I asked my office to look into the situation, to determine if there were other miners that had been left unprotected, to evaluate the Labor Cabinet Secretary's claim that there was nothing he could do and that it was simply a self-policing rule, and to ultimately come back with their findings. I have received that report, and it is startling. The report from this office, using information that anyone can access, much less the Labor Cabinet, shows that we have nearly 1,000 employees working just for mining companies that right now are unprotected by a performance bond that should be in place. Almost 1,000 miners work for a mining company that has existed less than 5 years and therefore under law must post that performance bond. Yet we have concluded that this Labor Cabinet has not secured one single performance bond for any mining company across Kentucky. There are nearly 30 licensed companies, and there could be more, that appear to be subject to this requirement, and the Labor Cabinet has not required one of them to post the bond to protect the workers. Moreover, we have learned that the Labor Cabinet absolutely knew about this law and their duty to enforce it. Indeed, in 2018, they testified in front of the state legislature that we should repeal this performance bond requirement. The committee voted it out, but it never received a vote on the floor. The legislature rejected their claim and their request to repeal this requirement. But what did the Labor Cabinet do? Nothing. They ignored the mandate they knew they had, and that the legislature had re-upped, had said we're not going to repeal and you must do your job. And between that testimony in 2018 and today, have secured 0 of these performance bonds. Last, we determined that the Labor Cabinet Secretary could have done his job, could have identified these companies and required the bonds simply by going online and accessing information that other cabinets had put up there that anyone in the world can look at to determine. It would be as easy as going to the Environmental and Energy Cabinet's website, looking at companies that have secured mining permits, and then going to the Secretary of State's website and simply searching each of those companies to determine how long they've been in business. It took my office a simple matter of days to determine that there were nearly 30 companies out there that are apparently operating outside of the requirements of the law. To determine that there were no performance bonds that were in place, we served an open records request on the Labor Cabinet, which asked for extra time. Extra time where they ultimately produced nearly 80 bonds, all of which were for construction companies, proving that they have required 0 mining companies to follow the law, and we see the result in what has happened in Black Jewel. My concern in seeing that construction companies had to post a bond is that this was an intentional decision to ignore a mandate passed by the legislature. And that intentional decision to ignore the law has created the situation that these Black Jewel miners are in and that others could fall into. This should be very disturbing for the citizens of Kentucky, should certainly be very disturbing for anyone who cares about those miners and wants our workers protected. And it sends a very clear message that the tools are already there to a labor cabinet. And I'll remind you that that labor cabinet works for Governor Bevin just like the Energy and Environmental Cabinet do. A simple phone call could have compiled this information by the Labor Cabinet Secretary. And remember, instead of pursuing and securing these bonds, he has spent the last several months trying to investigate and find teachers that came to the Capitol. In that lawsuit that we filed and in those actions, he claimed he had a duty to enforce all labor laws and that he had subpoena powers and other powers that he should use to secure information. He did that in an attempt to punish teachers, but he never did it in an attempt to protect miners. Today's information and report we're putting out should cause immediate action by this labor cabinet. They should not only verify this information on 30-plus companies, they should also go through all of the information that is available to them and every other cabinet. And they should, in a short period of time, require that these bonds not only be secured, but should be sent to the Labor Cabinet to be stored as is required under the law. The excuses that have been offered are unacceptable. Every day the legislature creates requirements on different parts of state government, and they don't have to tell you how to do your job. That's why we're hired. We wouldn't need a Labor Cabinet Secretary if the legislature created an automatic way to check. We have all those employees over there because when the legislature says we need this performance bond, it's our job as state employees to figure out how to get it done and to get it done. Sadly, this report comes too late to help the Black Jewel miners. But our hope is because we are putting it out, that it should cause the action to where no other miner is ever put in this situation again where the law is supposed to protect them, but the negligence of the Labor Cabinet and the Labor Cabinet Secretary has prevented them from having that security and those paychecks that they earned. I'm happy to take any questions. It is on its way. Well, listen, they knew in 2018 that they were supposed to enforce the law, and they didn't. They knew when they talked, I believe it was to the Herald Leader, about the fact that this bond wasn't in place for Black Jewel. That should have sent off alarms about, are they in place for other companies? And it appears that they haven't done anything. Hopefully today will create the type of shame that they deserve that will make them follow the law.
If this bond was on file, let's talk about the last situation. What would have happened? Would those workers have gotten paid?
So the bond is supposed to require, is supposed to cover 4 weeks of wages. I believe it is 2 to 3 weeks that is owed at maximum to any of those miners. All they would have had to do is to make a claim against that bond with the Labor Cabinet, and that bond should have paid their wages. Yeah.
Who are they supposed to file this bond with the Labor Cabinet?
It's in the Labor Cabinet, with the Labor Cabinet, and my understanding is that the bonds are kept with the Labor Cabinet Secretary in his office.
This is bigger than Black Jewel.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But if includes Black Jewel, how far back does it go?
So the statute only requires bonds from companies that have been operating less than 5 years in Kentucky. So our look back was 5 years, but during that 5-year period, the Labor Cabinet, at least in their response to the open records, shows 0 bonds having been secured.
Did you determine how many of these companies were started maybe before the implementation?
So if you look on the first sheet on the appendix, we've tried to give as much information as possible. And we have listed down there organization dates, but some of the organization dates may be a little different depending on when their operations started. So the statute requires, it could be a company, say, from out of state. But if they are operating for the first time in Kentucky, that bond is there. Oh, for me, this is about making a labor cabinet, any labor cabinet under any governor, simply do its job.
And how does the labor cabinet supposedly enforce the thing it's supposed to enforce?
Oh, they have statutory duty to impose significant fines for failing to provide the bond. They have had the statutory authority to require this from any company, that they simply had to get online or call over at one of their fellow cabinets to determine who fell within it. Within 2 days, we could get information that we believe show us the majority of the companies that may be out of compliance. They could have been doing that in the labor cabinet once a month, once a week. They could have asked Energy and Environment to send over new permits, and all they had to do was send a letter or make a call to that company, and then they had the authority to enforce it with significant punishment or penalty if they did not.
So it's a labor cabinet, like you say, we're doing the thing it's supposed to do.
Yes.
Black Jewel trying to be,
If the labor cabinet had been doing what it was supposed to do, there would be a bond in place right now that would have helped those Black Jewel miners. And the reason there would be the bond in place is if Black Jewel had refused, it would have been fined significantly. Every day, well, let me look at the fine is, I believe, on page 2 of the report. Any employer who violates it shall be fined no less than $100 nor more than $500 each day that it wasn't in place. So, in other words, when Black Jewel had started, the labor cabinet should have reached out and said, you owe us a bond. It needs to be in place at the start of your operations, and if you don't have it in place, we're going to start issuing fines.
so the way to calculate that would be each day, 365 times 5.
Well, if they had been doing if they had been doing their job, then yes. Now, look at where we are today. The labor cabinet hasn't enforced this at all. To my knowledge, hasn't made the first call or sent the first letter to a company saying you have to do this. Given that, I believe the right step would be to simply require them to do it quickly, set a deadline, and then any company that doesn't have their bond in by that deadline, then you start assessing the fines.
I'm looking at the back pages of the organization dates, 1993, 1985, 2008.
Mm-hmm.
Does this mean that they were out of compliance on that date from obviously 1993?
It does not. It would mean that their operations were new in the state or had ceased and rebegun in the last 5 years. So the way the statute works is it has to be 5 consecutive years that you've been operating in Kentucky to be exempt from the bond. So a company could be created in 93, could mine all the way up to 2015, could stop, right? Could end for a year and then could restart, and at that point they would need the bond again.
So the 5 years.
Yes. And so that does say that what we need to do is to delve a little deeper into each and every situation. There may be a company there that can provide an explanation for why they believe they are exempt, but the labor cabinet's not doing that. And our goal is to identify the scope of the problem and ultimately make sure this labor cabinet gets to work.
I want to focus on the people. So the people that work at this company. on
Yes.
the last page, if something happens with what happened with Blackpool, what happens to the 932 employees?
They may not get paid for wages for work that they've done. So what could happen to the employees here is exactly what happened in Black Jewel. If their company goes through a hard time, shuts down, files for bankruptcy, and doesn't do it the right way, in other words, does it the way that Black Jewel does, they could be in the same situation. They could have worked 3 weeks, have not been paid, and then have to go into a bankruptcy court to argue that they should be paid instead of having a bond right there that they can make a direct claim against. It means they could be out of luck and out of money for work that they've worked. It means that we could see black jewel situations all across Kentucky at all or potentially all of these groups. Okay.